have forced civilians to flee to neighboring countries. The influx of big numbers of refugees have placed an unusually heavy economic burden on these countries. Earlier, we were looking at Uganda, that has received hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from South Sudan. And tonight we've been asking, as South Africa, are we compassionate? Are we a safe haven for refugees? Or does their lives become very difficult once they come here to seek asylum, hoping for that refugee status? Joining us in studio is Human Rights Watch senior researcher Dewa Mavhinga. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Mavhinga. If you can judge a country by the dignity it gives to refugee seekers or asylum seekers, how are we doing as South Africa?
Well, it needs to be acknowledged that South Africa receives a disproportionately huge number of migrants, refugees and asylum seekers as compared to neighboring countries within Southern Africa or even across Africa, because we have refugees coming from as far as Somalia coming to South Africa. So that is a huge economic burden. But having said that, the administrative structures to process once asylum seekers are in South Africa have not worked as well as they should. So you would find that although South Africa hosts some 2 million migrants, for example, and a huge number of them are asylum seekers, those that actually get granted refugee status is a small number. So the process is very difficult. You end up having people having 6-monthly renewals of asylum seeker permits, and therefore, their rights, their access to education, to health, and to work become limited. Also, the issue of integration within communities is a challenge in South Africa. We have had successive waves of xenophobic violence, and that remains a huge challenge for the authorities in South Africa. But otherwise, we need to acknowledge that a huge number of migrants tend to choose South Africa as a destination because of its relative development when you compare to other countries neighboring.
Okay, so you've raised the challenge, and people are saying, lawyers for human rights saying in some cases up to 15 years you keep applying for that asylum status, waiting for your final decision on whether or not you will be given refugee status. Is that a lack of political will, or are we just overwhelmed?
It is a lack of political will, because if there is a clear directive from the leadership, then it means that the processing would be prioritized and there will be a specified and specific time. But in fact, South Africa does not appear to have found a clear way of handling the challenge of asylum seekers and refugees. So you'd find that this lack of processing for many, many years would be just a way of simply refusing to deal with an issue that is on the doorstep.
And does it go as far as being structural xenophobia, as some say? If we wanted to help people, we would. We're not helping them.
Yes, but you have also to consider that there are political ramifications. So perhaps at a leadership level, the political leadership would be thinking that embracing refugees and asylum seekers might have negative impact politically in terms of their political power base. Therefore, it is important for the leadership to get rid of what might seem to be structural xenophobia by embracing the idea that there is a responsibility and that South Africa should put in place the measures that would enable refugees and asylum seekers not only to have access to care services, but also to be able to contribute meaningfully to the economy of South Africa through taxes.
Yeah, you hear of doctors working as car guards because they don't have the documents. Yes. Do you think government is scared of opening the floodgates and then we get even more asylum seekers?
There is that fear, yes, and it has been communicated. But what is happening is not a solution. It is akin to burying your head in the sand. So there is need to confront the issues head on and find lasting solutions. But also for South Africa and for President Cyril Ramaphosa, it is important not only to accept and receive refugees in South Africa, but also to support in its foreign policy measures that ensure stability and peace in neighboring countries, so that you do not have this influx of asylum seekers coming to South Africa. If there is stability in those countries, for example, Zimbabwe, Mozambique and others, then it means that, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, people would not be flocking to South Africa.
Let's look at some of the serious claims made that government is ignoring court orders, a lot in relation to the refugee reception officers. So this is where you apply for an asylum permit and you keep renewing that asylum permit. And we were talking about the backlogs for years. How are people treated in those centres? They're claims that they're turned away. They're given documents, come back again and again and again, go to a different province, for example.
Yes, and there are a number of complaints from asylum seekers who have been mistreated, and also issues of demands for bribes from officials for them to be processed or to have some documents, which has led to people going underground and resorting to illegal documentation, which is another big problem. But we also need to acknowledge that in the previous years, South Africa has extended some kind of amnesty and documentation, the special permits for Zimbabweans and also for the people of Lesotho. But there is need perhaps to broaden that and ensure that it is sustainable, because the numbers are just too many for South Africa to handle through this very slow process at the centres.
And then we get to a situation when finally government makes a decision. 95% are told to ship back home. We were looking at a case earlier on the show where government said Syria is not a war zone.
That's a huge challenge, yes, because when you talk of the definition of a refugee in international law, it means that someone who is out of their country and is fleeing from persecution, political persecution, religious persecution or otherwise. So there is need for the authorities, those that are doing the administration in the Department of Home Affairs, to be sensitive to the challenges in these different countries. Surely Syria is an unstable state and it's a war zone, and this applies also to countries closer to South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo. South Sudan is a huge source of refugees.
Are we purposefully ignoring those countries in conflict? Earlier, the Department of Home Affairs was here saying we shouldn't see Africa as a basket case. Is that our stance?
It is unfortunately a strong perception that that is the stance. But what needs to be done now by the Department of International Relations and also the presidency is to have a more proactive position to promote peace and stability, for example, in South Sudan or in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is about to explode because President Kabila refuses to step down. So those are the things that South Africa can use its political and economic muscle to ensure that we are moving as Africa in the right direction. South Africa should not be ashamed of its political and economic muscle. It must use it for the benefit of all Africans.
Then a serious claim in relation to human rights, that we are making children stateless. They sometimes don't get birth certificates if their mother or father is undocumented. What should South Africa be doing there? What is the right thing to do?
That's a huge challenge, and we also see a similar challenge in the US with regards to children. There is need for South Africa to take a deliberate stance that no child should be stateless on account of the status of the parents, but that automatically at birth there must be some documentation available which should ensure that that child has an option to have South Africa, by virtue of being born in South Africa, have all the benefits that accrue with that. So this is a gap that is there, and we hope that the authorities will take the steps, especially as we mark World Refugee Day.
And it's a big gap because you can't get an education without a proper birth certificate. Sometimes they're handwritten. It depends on paternity tests. You can't get adopted if you're looking for a home. Should we put a time limit on how quickly should government be issuing those birth certificates?
Well, it would depend on the logistics of a particular government, but it should be within a reasonable time frame, so that because failure to do that would mean that a child is put away from these basic benefits. So to ensure that every child has this benefit, it should be as swiftly as is possible in terms of the mechanisms in the administrative departments of South Africa.
All right, thank you for your time tonight. That was a Human Rights Watch senior researcher, Dewa Mavhinga. We take a short break. We'll be back with more news.